Sweat stung Arthur's eyes as the bunker rattled, shaking dust from the cracked ceiling onto the bodies of his friends. High Command promised reinforcements a week ago. Yesterday, they stopped answering the comms. We were dead meat, just waiting for the butcher's blade to drop. Nobody believed in miracles anymore out on this rock. But miracles don't come quietly. Sometimes they tear a hole in reality and scream out of the void, daring hell itself to push back. Dust coated the back of Arthur's throat, thick and tasting faintly of copper and ozone. He swallowed, but there was no saliva left, just a dry, scraping friction that made him cough. A bad cough, the kind that rattled in his ribs and made the bruised cartilage pop. He huddled in the corner of Sector 4's primary munitions bunker, his knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapped around his shins. He was 38 years old, a logistics coordinator who had spent the last decade tracking shipping manifests and synthetic protein yields. Now he was holding a standard-issue kinetic rifle he hadn't cleaned, surrounded by people who were about to die. Another artillery shell impacted somewhere above. The acoustic dampeners in the walls had blown out 2 days ago, so the sound was no longer a muffled thud. It was a physical strike. The kinetic wave transferred through the bedrock, up through the synthcrete floor, and directly into the base of Arthur's spine. His teeth clicked together hard enough to chip a molar. He tasted blood. "Battery 3 is gone," Cole muttered from the communications console. Cole was barely 20. His face smeared with grease and dried blood from a nasty gash across his forehead. He didn't look up from the flickering amber screens. He didn't even sound panicked anymore, just tired, the hollow, flat exhaustion of a man who had accepted his own autopsy report before the body was cold. Arthur didn't reply. He stared at his own hands. They were trembling, a fine, rapid vibration that he couldn't stop no matter how hard he clenched his fists. He hated himself for it. In the recruitment vids, the men facing impossible odds always looked resolute. They set their jaws. They made peace with their gods. Arthur hadn't thought about God in 15 years, and the only thing he felt was an overwhelming, pathetic urge to urinate and a desperate, clawing desire to be anywhere but here. "Did you hear me, Artie?" Cole asked, his voice cracking. "Battery 3, the eastern ridge is open. They're going to walk right through." "I heard you," Arthur snapped. His voice sounded thin, reedy. He cleared his throat and tried to sound authoritative. It failed. "Keep trying the fleet relay. Maybe the ion storms cleared up." "There is no fleet relay," Sarah said. She was sitting on an upturned ammunition crate across the room, meticulously wrapping a compression bandage around a stump where Jenkins' left arm used to be. Jenkins was unconscious, breathing in ragged, bubbling gasps. Sarah pulled the bandage tight, her hands slick with arterial spray that had already begun to turn brown and tacky in the dry air of the bunker. She tied it off, wiped her forehead with the back of a relatively clean wrist, and looked at Arthur. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them bruised black from lack of sleep. "Command left us here. You know they did. The moment the outer perimeter sensors showed the enemy tonnage, they cut the umbilical. We're a write-off, an acceptable, localized loss." Arthur wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she was being defeatist, that the United Colonial Defense Force didn't abandon 90,000 civilians and a garrison of 5,000 under-equipped volunteers. But the lie wouldn't form on his tongue. The air smelled of burnt hair and melted plastics. The ventilation system had been dragging in the stench of the burning colony for 48 hours. He leaned his head back against the cold, vibrating metal of the bulkhead. "Just keep cycling the distress beacon, Cole. Narrow band, wide band, whatever. Just leave it on auto-repeat." "It's just shouting into a hurricane," Cole whispered, but his fingers danced over the cracked glass of the console anyway. They all knew what was outside. The enemy didn't bother with names, and humanity hadn't given them one yet, mostly because no one who had engaged them lived long enough to report back with anything other than frantic telemetry. They were just brutal, biomechanical nightmares that dropped from the sky in jagged, heat-scarred monoliths. They didn't demand surrender. They didn't take prisoners. They just consumed, leaving worlds looking like stripped carcasses. Arthur closed his eyes. He thought of his apartment back on New Terra. The smell of real coffee, the soft hum of the climate control. He realized with a sickening jolt of shame that if he could trade the lives of everyone in this room for a guaranteed ticket back to that apartment, he would do it. He wouldn't even hesitate. The realization made his stomach churn. A high-pitched screech echoed down the corridor outside their reinforced blast door. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, wet, and piercing, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of metal slamming against metal. Sarah froze, her hands hovering over Jenkins's chest. Cole stopped typing. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The air suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The smell of ozone spiked, sharp and bitter. "They breached the lower levels?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the failing generator. "How?" Arthur demanded, his voice pitching up in panic. "The blast doors down there are 3 feet of solid titanium. It would take them days to cut through." "They aren't cutting," Cole said. He was staring at a secondary monitor, his face bathed in a sickly green glow. "Oh God. They're just ramming it. Mass bodies. They're piling up and letting the ones behind them crush them against the doors until the hydraulic seals pop." Arthur felt the bile rise in his throat. He scrambled to his feet, his knees popping, his rifle dangling uselessly from its sling. He backed away from the main door, his boots slipping on something wet. He didn't look down to see what it was. He just kept backing up until he hit the rear wall of the bunker. There was nowhere else to go. The thudding grew louder. It wasn't a steady rhythm anymore. It was a chaotic, rolling thunder of impacts hitting the corridor walls outside. The reinforced steel door of their bunker, the only thing standing between them and the slaughter, groaned. Arthur pressed his spine against the cold wall, hyperventilating. His chest heaved, pulling in shallow, useless breaths of stale air. "I don't want to die here," he thought. "Not in the dark, not smelling like fear and piss." "Cole, give me your sidearm," Sarah said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Arthur looked over. Sarah was standing over Jenkins. The unconscious man was still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jerky motions. Sarah had drawn her own pistol and was checking the charge pack. "What?" Cole stammered, tearing his eyes away from the telemetry screen. "Your sidearm. Give it to me," Sarah repeated. She didn't look at Cole. She looked at the heavy blast doors. A deep, horizontal dent had just appeared in the center of the metal, accompanied by a shriek of tortured steel. "I have 2 rounds left. I'm not letting them take Jenkins alive. I'm not letting them take me alive. Give me the gun, Cole." Arthur watched this happen, as if through a thick pane of glass. He was detached from it. His brain was misfiring, retreating into a primitive state of pure flight, but his body was caged. He wanted to scream at Sarah to stop, to fight, to do something heroic, but the gun in his own hands felt like a useless toy. Cole fumbled with his holster, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the pistol onto the grating. It clattered loudly. He fell to his knees to pick it up, sobbing. Real, ugly tears tracked through the grease on his face. He handed it up to Sarah. "Thank you," she said softly. Boom! The blast door buckled inward. The hydraulic hinges on the left side screamed, popping bolts the size of a man's forearm. One of the bolts ricocheted across the room, sparking off the ceiling and smashing into the communications console. Cole shrieked and covered his head. The console shattered, raining glass and sparks down onto his back. The room plunged into emergency red lighting. The crimson hue washed over the bunker, turning the pooling blood on the floor black. Arthur whimpered. He couldn't help it. The sound escaped his lips before he could bite it down. He raised his kinetic rifle, his finger slick with sweat on the trigger guard. He couldn't even aim properly. The weapon was heavy, and his arms felt like they were filled with sand. Boom! A jagged tear opened in the center of the blast door. Through the gap, Arthur saw movement. Not soldiers, just a writhing, chitinous mass of dark, metallic-looking limbs and reflective, soulless eyes. The smell hit them immediately. A suffocating wave of rotting meat and burning sulfur. It was the stench of an abattoir left in the sun. "Artie," Sarah said. She was standing in front of Jenkins, holding a pistol in each hand. She looked back at him, her silhouette harsh in the red emergency lighting. "Don't let them take you." Arthur couldn't speak. He just stared at the tear in the door. Boom! The door tore completely off its hinges, collapsing inward with a deafening crash that shook the dust from Arthur's hair. The shockwave knocked him off his feet. He hit the grating hard, his rifle clattering away into the dark. Pain exploded in his shoulder, sharp and blinding, but it was immediately swallowed by a tidal wave of sheer terror. They poured in. There was no battle cry, no tactical formation. The enemy just spilled over the fallen blast door like a wave of dark-bladed liquid. They were horrifyingly fast, moving with a jagged, skittering grace that defied physics. Arthur scrambled backward on his elbows, kicking his boots against the floor, trying to press himself into the very molecular structure of the wall. Sarah fired. The harsh, cracking reports of the pistols filled the small room. The flashes illuminated the horrors in strobing bursts of blue light. She hit one in the center of its mass. It didn't even flinch. It just vaulted over the console and took her. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to see it. He pressed his hands over his ears, but he couldn't block out the wet, tearing sounds. The screaming. Cole was screaming, a high, piercing sound that abruptly ended in a sickening crunch. It's my turn, Arthur thought, his mind snapping into a strange, floating clarity. I'm going to die right now. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the impact, waiting for the blinding pain. He smelled the sulfur. He felt the unnatural heat radiating off their bodies. A heavy, clawed appendage slammed into the grating right next to his leg. He held his breath. Then the floor dropped out from under the world. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't an artillery strike. It was a localized gravitational anomaly so severe that Arthur's stomach slammed into his diaphragm. His ears popped with agonizing force as the atmospheric pressure inside the bunker instantly zeroed out, then rushed back in. The creatures in the room suddenly froze, their metallic shrieks cutting off as they all turned their angular, faceless heads toward the ceiling. A sound followed. It was not a noise meant for human ears. It was a low vibrational frequency that started in the marrow of Arthur's bones and vibrated outward, shaking the loose fillings in his teeth. It grew in volume, rising from a bass hum to a deafening, terrifying roar that threatened to split his skull open. It sounded like the sky was being ripped apart like a cheap bedsheet. Above them, through miles of bedrock and synthcrete, the atmosphere of New Texas was burning. Arthur opened his eyes. The creatures were agitated, spinning in erratic circles, their scythe-like limbs clicking against the floor. They abandoned Arthur, scrambling over the ruined blast door and back into the corridor. The roaring grew louder. The bunker shook violently, but it wasn't the sharp, concussive impact of artillery. It was a sustained, massive seismic event. Dust poured from the ceiling in a solid sheet. The red emergency lights flickered and died, leaving Arthur in absolute pitch-black darkness. He lay there in the dark, gasping for air, clutching his bruised shoulder. The roaring sound peaked, hitting a crescendo that literally threw Arthur a few inches off the floor. Then, an impact. It hit the planet's surface with the force of an extinction-level meteor. The shockwave traveled down through the crust, hitting the subterranean bunker and buckling the reinforced walls. Arthur was thrown sideways, slamming his head against an overturned munitions crate. Stars burst behind his eyelids. Through the ringing in his ears, a new sound cut through the darkness. It was a mechanical whine, a deep, throaty spooling of hyper-dense machinery. It was coming from above. It was coming from the surface. Arthur forced himself to his hands and knees. His head swam, blood dripping from his nose onto his lips. He tasted the salt. He felt around in the dark until his fingers brushed the cold, hard stock of his dropped rifle. He gripped it like a lifeline, using it to haul himself upright. "Sarah!" he croaked. The bunker was silent, save for the massive, vibrating hum from above. "Cole?" Nothing. Arthur stumbled toward the shattered blast door, his boots slipping on the slick grating. He reached the corridor. The emergency lights out here were still functioning, casting a dim, flickering yellow glow over the carnage. The corridor was empty of the enemy. They had all fled upward. Arthur didn't know what possessed him to follow them. It wasn't bravery. It was a primal, confused instinct. The bunker was a tomb. The air was running out. If he was going to die, he didn't want to die in a dark hole smelling of his friend's blood. He leaned heavily against the wall, dragging his feet, moving toward the primary lift shaft that led to the surface. His breathing was loud in his own ears. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder and ribs. When he reached the central concourse, the sheer scale of what had happened hit him. The massive, armored ceiling of the concourse, 20 feet of solid rock and steel designed to withstand orbital bombardment, was gone. It had been punched through. Arthur stared upward, his jaw slack. A jagged, smoking hole, hundreds of feet wide, opened up into the night sky. But he couldn't see the stars. The sky was completely blocked out by a hull. It was a slab of metal, so massive, so impossibly huge that Arthur's brain refused to process the scale. It hung in the low atmosphere, defying gravity through sheer, brute force engine power. The underbelly of the ship was scarred black, glowing cherry red in places from an atmospheric entry that must have violated every safety protocol in the naval manual. It hadn't decelerated in orbit. It had dropped out of faster-than-light transit directly into the planet's atmosphere. It had used the friction of the air itself to brake, a maneuver so reckless, so dangerously arrogant that Arthur couldn't comprehend it. Massive, venting thrusters poured blue-white plasma down onto the surface, illuminating the ruined landscape of the outpost, and etched onto the side of the towering, angular hull, illuminated by the fires of the burning city, was a massive scarred insignia, a stylized, winged sword over a globe. United Colonial Fleet, Earth. They had come. Tears, hot, unbidden, and humiliating, spilled over Arthur's cheeks, cutting tracks through the grime. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the crater. The howl of the ship's engines changed pitch, dropping to a low, predatory growl. From the belly of the beast, launch bay doors the size of city blocks began to grind open. The enemy had gathered on the surface. Tens of thousands of the biomechanical horrors swarmed over the ruins of New Texas, screeching their defiance up at the massive ship. They looked like a sea of black glass, shifting and clicking, preparing to leap. They didn't get the chance. The ship didn't broadcast a warning. It didn't demand surrender. It didn't try to communicate at all. From the open bays, dark shapes plummeted. They fell like iron hail, thousands of them, slamming into the ground with the force of small bombs. The impacts threw up plumes of dust and shattered asphalt, drop pods. Before the dust even settled, the heavy, explosive bolts on the pods blew. The doors kicked outward, crushing the enemy beneath them, and out stepped the armor. They were massive walking tanks, 10 feet of sloped, ablative armor, hydraulic servos hissing in the cold air. They carried rotary cannons and plasma projectors that required dedicated power plants. They didn't move with the skittering, unnatural grace of the aliens. They moved with slow, deliberate, unstoppable weight. An alien leaped at the nearest armored figure, its scythe limbs raised to impale. The human didn't even raise its weapon. It simply stepped forward and swung a massive, gauntleted fist. The impact sounded like a car crash. The alien shattered, its exoskeleton exploding into a spray of dark fluid and jagged shrapnel. Then the humans opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. The rotary cannons roared, tearing the air apart, spitting streams of depleted uranium rounds that turned the dark sea of aliens into a churning meat grinder. Plasma splashed against the ruins, burning with a light so bright Arthur had to shield his eyes. The slaughter was systematic, brutal, and entirely without mercy. The humans didn't break formation. They just walked forward, a wall of iron and fire, stepping over the twitching remains of the things that had butchered Arthur's colony. Arthur sat on the edge of the crater, his useless rifle lying forgotten in the dirt. He watched the fire wash over the enemy. He watched the salvation of New Texas, delivered not by angels, but by men who fought like demons. A heavy boot stepped onto the synthcrete behind him. Arthur flinched, spinning around. A lone human soldier stood there. He wore standard infantry combat armor, scarred and blackened by orbital drop heat. He held a heavy rifle casually in one hand. The soldier reached up and unlatched his helmet, pulling it off with a hiss of releasing pressure. He was older than Arthur, his face weathered and lined, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth. He spit a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the floor, right onto the severed limb of one of the aliens. The soldier looked at Arthur. He looked at Arthur's trembling hands, the tear-streaked face, the urine stain on his trousers. The soldier didn't sneer. He didn't look heroic. He just looked exhausted, smelling of cordite, stale sweat, and cheap tobacco. "You look like hell, buddy," the soldier said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He reached down a massive armored hand. "Name's Brody. We got your beacon. Sorry we're late to the party. Traffic was a bitch." Arthur looked at the hand. He looked up at Brody's scarred, deeply human face. And for the first time in 3 days, Arthur let out a sound that wasn't a sob. He laughed. It was a broken, hysterical, ugly sound, but he didn't care. He grabbed Brody's hand. The grip was tight, rough, and real. They thought no aid was coming, but humanity didn't send aid. Humanity sent war, and it had arrived howling from the void. Thank you for watching this story. If you felt the rumble of those drop pods and love seeing humanity strike back from the void, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies who need their daily dose of HFY storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new broadcast from the front lines. What did you think of Arthur's survival? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next story. Brody pulled Arthur up. The grip was strong enough to bruise the flesh right down to the bone. Arthur's legs gave out immediately. He didn't just stumble. His knees turned to water. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow, leaving him trembling so violently his teeth rattled together. Brody caught him under the armpit, hoisting him up with an effortless grunt, the hydraulic servos in his infantry armor whining in protest against the sudden dead weight. "Easy, pal. I got you," Brody muttered. His breath smelled of stale tobacco, synthetic coffee, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Arthur leaned his entire weight against the soldier's ablative plating. It was warm, radiating the immense thermal energy of the orbital drop. The metal was pitted, scarred by micro-impacts and atmospheric friction, rough to the touch, like coarse sandpaper. He felt the steady mechanical vibration of the armor's power core humming directly against his bruised ribs. They walked out of the shattered concourse and onto the ruined surface of New Texas. The sky was no longer choked with the suffocating darkness of the alien swarm. It was choked with human exhaust. The massive warship, still hovering above like a vengeful steel god, bathed the ruined colony in the harsh, flat glare of industrial floodlights. The air was thick, tasting of ash, vaporized concrete, and a strange, bitter chemical tang that coated the roof of Arthur's mouth. The chaotic screeching of the aliens had been completely replaced by the deafening, organized chaos of a human beachhead. Heavy transport landers, ugly and utilitarian, touched down with earth-shaking thuds. Their heavy steel loading ramps slammed into the dirt before the landing gear had even fully compressed. "Medic!" Brody bellowed, his voice raw, gravelly, and loud enough to make Arthur flinch. A woman in lightweight, blood-spattered medical fatigues jogged over. She didn't look like an angelic savior. She looked exhausted. Her blonde hair was plastered to her skull with sweat, and deep purple bags hung under her eyes. A dirt-smudged name tape on her chest read Hayes. "Civilian survivor," Brody said, unceremoniously depositing Arthur onto a shattered slab of synthcrete. "Found him in the sub-level bunker. He's in deep shock. Check him for internal bleeding and crush trauma." "Sit still," Hayes ordered. Her voice was completely flat, devoid of any comforting bedside manner. She slapped a rigid diagnostic cuff around Arthur's wrist. It pinched the skin sharply, emitting a high-pitched hum as it drew a microscopic blood sample. Arthur stared down at his hands. The fine, rapid trembling hadn't stopped. He looked back toward the dark, smoking hole of the bunker entrance. "Sarah," he whispered. His throat was so dry the word barely made a sound, catching like sandpaper. He swallowed hard and tried again. "Sarah and Cole, they were in the comms room, Sector 4. Brody paused, his massive gauntlet resting casually on the pistol grip of his rifle. He looked down at Arthur, then over at Hayes. He didn't say anything, but Arthur caught the slight, imperceptible shake of the soldier's head. "I'll send a crawler drone down," Brody said gruffly. "But don't get your hopes up, buddy. We saw the telemetry of what was down there before we breached." Arthur nodded dumbly. He felt a sickening, twisting knot of guilt form in his stomach. He knew he should be screaming for them. He knew he should be demanding a rescue party, grabbing Brody's armor and begging. But the overwhelming, shameful truth was that he was just glad he wasn't down in that pitch-black hole anymore. He was alive. He hated himself for the profound, selfish relief washing over him. Hayes ripped open a foil packet with her teeth. The sharp, sterile smell of medical alcohol pierced the omnipresent stench of the battlefield. She pressed a cold, pneumatic injector directly against the side of Arthur's neck. Hiss, a cold rush of liquid shot into his jugular vein. Almost instantly, the violent trembling in his limbs subsided. His erratic, hammering heartbeat slowed to a steady, heavy rhythm. The sharp, jagged edges of his sheer panic dulled into a heavy, narcotic numbness. "Neurostabilizers," Hayes muttered, reading the scrolling green output on her datapad. "You're severely malnourished, clinically dehydrated, and you have a hairline fracture in your left clavicle. But you'll live. Stay exactly here. Do not move. If you wander into the forward firing lines, a stray depleted uranium slug will turn you into pink mist before you even hear the shot. Without waiting for a response, she turned and jogged away toward a line of groaning stretchers being unloaded from a nearby dropship. Arthur sat alone on the cold concrete. He pulled a crinkling foil emergency blanket tight around his shivering shoulders. He watched the human military machine unpack itself. It wasn't elegant. It was a brutal, industrial process of logistics and mathematics. Prefabricated barricades were slammed into place by heavy loaders. Ammunition crates the size of small houses were dragged across the dirt, gouging deep trenches in the earth. It was a stark contrast, the polished recruitment vids broadcast back on Earth. There were no pristine dress uniforms, no swelling orchestral music, no heroic monologues, just tired, angry people in dirty, heavy armor, shouting profanities over the roar of plasma engines, methodically preparing to execute horrific violence. And Arthur, sitting in the ash, wrapped in cheap foil, smelling of his own dried urine and fear, had never felt so safe in his entire life. The temporary calm of the landing zone lasted exactly 22 minutes. Arthur sat against a rusted support beam, nursing a heated ration pouch of synthetic broth that tasted vaguely of salted cardboard. The neurostabilizers had cleared his head, but they left him feeling disconnected, watching the world through a sheet of thick glass. The low, subsonic thrum of the human warship's sensors suddenly shifted pitch. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a deep, heavy vibration that rattled the loose gravel around Arthur's boots. Actual to all ground elements. Swarm convergence detected. Grid sector 7-9er. They're pooling. Mass organic thermal blooms. Brace for impact. Weapons free. The radio chatter echoed from a nearby command tent, stripped of any panic. It sounded like a logistics coordinator announcing a slight delay in a shipping manifest. Arthur looked toward the horizon. The ruins of New Texas were illuminated by the harsh white glare of the ship's spotlights. At the edge of the light, the darkness began to move. It wasn't individual creatures this time. It was a tidal wave, a massive, churning ocean of black chitin and gleaming scythe-like limbs pouring over the shattered remains of the colony's defensive wall. They didn't screech this time. The sheer volume of their movement created a sound like a million pieces of broken glass being ground together in a massive industrial blender. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The primal terror clawed at the edges of the medical stabilizers, threatening to break through. There were too many of them. The human beachhead was heavily armed, but they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. He waited for the human infantry to fall back. He waited for them to scream, to retreat toward the dropships. They didn't move an inch. A line of heavy mechanized infantry, 30 men and women encased in the massive walking tank armor Arthur had seen earlier, stepped forward to the barricades. They didn't take cover. They just planted their heavy magnetic boots into the dirt and leveled their rotary cannons. The alien wave hit the kill zone. The human response was not a battle, it was an extermination. The rotary cannons spun up with a deafening metallic whine, followed instantly by a continuous ripping roar that tore the very air apart. Streams of depleted uranium rounds, glowing dull red from friction carved into the swarm. Arthur clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound bypassed his eardrums entirely, vibrating through his jaw and skull. The front line of the alien swarm didn't just die, they disintegrated. The kinetic force of the human weaponry vaporized their organic components, sending geysers of dark, viscous fluid spraying into the air. The smell hit the camp seconds later, a suffocating, horrific blend of aerosolized copper, burnt sulfur, and flash-fried meat. The swarm kept coming, blindly climbing over the shattered, twitching remains of their own dead, trying to close the gap. "Artillery!" a voice barked calmly over the loudspeaker. From the underbelly of the massive warship hovering above, deep, booming thuds echoed. Seconds later, the ground halfway between the barricades and the colony wall erupted. It wasn't high explosive. It was white phosphorus and plasma payload. Blinding, localized suns ignited in the center of the alien swarm. The heat was so intense that Arthur, sitting hundreds of yards away, felt the skin on his face pull tight and blister. the aliens caught in the blast radius didn't burn, they melted. Their metallic carapaces glowed cherry red, then white, before collapsing into bubbling pools of slag. Arthur watched, mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it. He looked at a tactical monitor mounted on the side of a nearby munitions hauler. The screen displayed cold, hard data, eradicated. The words sat there on the glowing screen, not defeated, not repelled, eradicated. The human military didn't view this as a fight for survival. They viewed it as a pest control problem. A fresh wave of aliens managed to break through the plasma fire, their carapaces smoking, closing within 50 yards of the infantry line. "Fix bayonets!" a sergeant yelled. The command seemed absurd to Arthur. Bayonets? Against that? The heavy infantry didn't flinch. With a synchronized metallic clack, massive, humming monomolecular blades snapped out from beneath the barrels of their cannons. The blades vibrated with a vicious, high-frequency hum that set Arthur's teeth on edge. The aliens leapt. The infantry stepped forward, swinging the weapons like halberds. The monomolecular blades didn't cut, they simply severed the molecular bonds of whatever they touched. Alien limbs, torsos, and heads were sheared off with zero resistance. A severed alien head, its jaw still snapping frantically, landed in the dirt a few feet from Arthur. Black fluid leaked from its jagged neck, smoking as it hit the cold concrete. The creature's multifaceted eyes locked onto Arthur. Arthur didn't scramble away. He didn't scream. He looked at the dying thing, and then he looked back at the line of human soldiers methodically butchering the swarm. He realized with a cold, terrifying clarity why the rest of the galaxy left humanity alone. The aliens were a force of nature, a mindless, consuming plague. But humanity was a machine, a calculating, industrialized engine of violence that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing its own kind, only to turn that terrible expertise outward into the void. Brody walked past, his armor smeared with black alien gore. He stopped, popped the seal on his helmet, and spat another stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. He looked at the carnage, then looked at Arthur. "Hell of a light show, ain't it?" Brody asked, his voice completely devoid of adrenaline or fear, just tired routine. Arthur pulled the thin foil blanket tighter around his shoulders. He looked at the piles of alien dead, the burning skyline, and the massive, hovering warship that had brought hell to the monsters. "Yeah," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "It's beautiful." Ash drifted down from the upper atmosphere in heavy grey flakes, coating the landing zone in a layer of synthetic snow. It was the byproduct of the orbital bombardment: pulverized bedrock, vaporized chitin, and the incinerated remnants of the colony's eastern agricultural domes. It settled on Arthur's shoulders, sticking to the sweat and grime that plastered his uniform to his skin. The deafening roar of the battle had finally subsided, replaced by a massive, industrial hum that seemed to vibrate from the center of the planet itself. Arthur remained seated on his overturned crate, watching the human war machine transition from a state of frenzied slaughter to a cold, methodical cleanup operation. The line of heavy infantry had stopped firing. Their massive, rotary cannons hissed as cooling vents blew clouds of white steam into the freezing night air. The barrels glowed a dull, angry orange in the gloom. Nobody cheered. Nobody high-fived or collapsed into heroic embraces. They just started reloading. Logistics personnel, wearing unarmored exosuits that whined with every step, hauled massive pallets of kinetic ammunition toward the frontline barricades. They moved with the exhausted efficiency of factory workers at the end of a double shift. A loader stomped past Arthur, carrying a crate of depleted uranium slugs that must have weighed a ton. The operator inside the cage was a middle-aged woman chewing on a piece of synthetic gum. She didn't even look at the piles of alien corpses smoking 50 yards away. She just checked her data pad, keyed in a serial number, and dropped the crate with a heavy metallic clang. The smell of the alien dead was inescapable. It had evolved from a sharp, burning sulfur into a heavy, sickeningly sweet stench of rotting biomass and ozone. It coated the back of Arthur's throat, making the synthetic broth he had just consumed churn violently in his stomach. He swallowed hard, forcing the nausea down. He couldn't afford to throw up. He was too dehydrated. A heavy mechanized transport crawler rumbled to a halt a few yards away. The rear ramp hissed and slammed into the ash-covered concrete. A logistics officer stepped off. He wore a standard-issue fleet uniform, sharp and clean compared to the grunts, with a data pad strapped to his left forearm. He looked around the triage area, his eyes sweeping over the wounded civilians and exhausted soldiers with absolute detachment. "Quartermaster Reed," the officer announced to the general vicinity. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sharp edge of authority. "I need an asset count on the civilian garrison. Who is the ranking colonial officer here?" Nobody answered. The wounded just groaned. A medic applying a coagulant foam to a soldier's shattered leg didn't even look up. Arthur looked at his own hands. The neurostabilizers Hayes had pumped into his neck were wearing off, leaving a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes and a returning tremor in his fingers. He was a low-level logistics coordinator. He wasn't command staff. He wasn't even middle management. But the regional director was dead. The garrison commander was dead. Sarah was... He cut the thought off before it could form. Arthur forced himself to stand. His joints popped, the bruised cartilage in his ribs flaring with a sharp, stabbing pain. He pulled the thin foil emergency blanket tighter around his shoulders, shivering as the cold wind whipped through the ruined concourse. "I am," Arthur croaked. Reed turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in Arthur's pathetic state. The soiled uniform, the trembling hands, the dried blood smeared across his cheek. Reed didn't look impressed, but he didn't look pitiful either. He just tapped his data pad. "Name and operating number," Reed demanded. Arthur Pendleton, Colonial ID 449-7. Reed punched the numbers in. A green light blinked on his pad. "Congratulations, Pendleton. You are officially the senior surviving administrator of the new Texas colony, which means you are my problem." Arthur blinked, the words washing over him without fully computing. "Administrator, there were 90,000 people here. There has to be someone higher up." "There isn't," Reed said flatly. "Orbital scans confirm a 98% mortality rate in the primary civilian sectors. The swarm hit the residential blocks before our fleet even dropped out of hyperspace. You're what's left. Now I need a functional manifest of your surviving agricultural synthesizers and water filtration units. The fleet isn't leaving a garrison here to babysit a dead rock, and we aren't cracking our own supply lines to feed you on the evacuation ships. We take what you have left." The cold, brutal calculus of it hit Arthur like a physical blow. 90,000 people, gone. Entire neighborhoods, schools, commercial districts, wiped off the map in less than 72 hours. And this man was asking for an inventory check. But a strange, perverse comfort bloomed in Arthur's chest. This was spreadsheets. This was inventory. This was a language he understood. It was a sterile, controllable box he could shove his mind into so he wouldn't have to think about the screaming in the bunker. The primary water filtration plant in Sector 2 was overrun, Arthur stammered, his mind racing to recall the grid layouts he had stared at for 10 years. But the subterranean backup reservoirs in Sector 5 have independent manual locks. If the swarm didn't breach the bedrock, there's 3 million gallons of potable water down there. The synthesizers in the hydroponic bays are scrap, but we have a fortified seed bank and freeze-dried nutrient paste in the deep storage vaults. Reed finally looked up from his data pad, meeting Arthur's eyes. The disdain was gone, replaced by a flicker of professional approval. "Good. Give me the access codes to Sector 5. Arthur rattled off the complex alphanumeric sequences. Reed typed them in, his fingers flying across the glass screen. "We're sending a heavy extraction team to the reservoirs now," Reed said, turning away. "Get yourself onto evac transport Delta 9er. You're leaving this rock in 2 hours, Pendleton." Arthur watched the officer walk away, disappearing into the chaotic churn of the landing zone. Leaving, the word echoed in his skull. He was getting off this planet. He was going back to Earth. He would have his apartment, his synthetic coffee, his climate control. He had survived. He waited for the immense wave of relief to wash over him. He waited to feel joy, or at least a profound, cleansing gratitude. It never came. Instead, a heavy, suffocating weight settled right in the center of his chest. It felt like he had swallowed a lead weight. He looked at the smoking crater that led down to the command bunker. The rescue crawlers hadn't come back up. Boot steps crunched heavily on the gravel behind him. Arthur didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy hydraulic whine of the infantry armor was distinct. Brody stopped beside him. The soldier had wiped the worst of the alien gore off his faceplate, but his armor was still scorched black and stank of burnt ozone. He was holding a battered, blood-stained data drive in his massive, armored fist. "Crawler drone came back up," Brody said. His voice was quieter now, lacking the gravelly bravado from before. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much death and was too tired to pretend it didn't matter. Arthur stared at the data drive. He knew exactly what it was. It was the core memory bank from the Sector 4 communications console, Cole's console. "Did they?" Arthur started, but his voice failed. He tried to swallow, but his throat was completely dry. "No," Brody said softly. "They didn't make it." Drone footage confirmed 2 human casualties in the primary comms room. The swarm breached the blast doors. Arthur closed his eyes. The red emergency lights flashed behind his eyelids. He heard the screaming again. He heard the wet, tearing sounds. "I need to go down there," Arthur whispered. Brody frowned, the heavy scar on his chin twisting. "The hell you do? The area is irradiated from the plasma strikes, and the structural integrity of the sub-levels is compromised. There's nothing down there for you, buddy. Just ghosts and crushed concrete." "I have to confirm the colonial asset tags," Arthur lied. It was a stupid, transparent lie, but he couldn't form the real words. He couldn't tell this giant, battle-hardened soldier that he needed to see them to believe it. He needed to punish himself for running, for hiding in the dark while Sarah held the line. Brody stared at him for a long, heavy moment. He chewed on the end of his unlit cigar, his eyes scanning Arthur's face. Finally he sighed, a deep, mechanical sound that hissed through his armor's exhaust ports. "Fine. Grab a rebreather from the supply crate. We go down, we scan the tags, we come right back up. You wander off, I'll shoot you myself to save the structural collapse the trouble." 10 minutes later, Arthur was standing in the shattered remains of the central elevator shaft. A heavy, industrial flashlight was clamped to Brody's shoulder, cutting a harsh, stark white beam through the choking dust. The air down here was thick and tasted of pulverized stone and dried blood. The rebreather mask strapped over Arthur's face hissed with every shallow breath he took, providing a flow of filtered, sterile oxygen that felt jarringly out of place in the tomb. They climbed down the emergency maintenance ladder. Arthur's fractured clavicle screamed with every rung, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When they reached the bottom, the corridor was a nightmare of twisted metal and cooling slag. The plasma strikes from the surface had melted through the upper ceilings, leaving glowing pools of molten rock that cast warped, orange shadows against the walls. The carcasses of the alien swarm were everywhere, piled high, their metallic limbs fused together by the intense heat. Brody walked point, his heavy boots crushing the brittle, charred remains of the enemy. He kept his rifle raised, sweeping the beam of light back and forth across the gloom. "Over here," Brody grunted, stopping in front of a jagged, gaping hole in the wall. It was the main blast door to the Sector 4 bunker. It wasn't just torn off its hinges, it had been bent completely backward, the 3-foot-thick titanium warped like cheap tin. Arthur stepped into the room. It looked smaller than he remembered. The harsh white light from Brody's shoulder lamp illuminated the destruction with brutal clarity. The communications console was a shattered ruin of glass and sparking wires. Cole was behind the console, or at least what was left of him. The young man had been pulled halfway over the metal desk. Arthur didn't look closely. He couldn't. He focused his eyes on the floor, forcing himself to breathe through the rubber mouthpiece of the rebreather. Then he saw her. Sarah was slumped against the far wall, sitting on the metal grating. Her empty pistols lay on the floor near her outstretched hands. The swarm hadn't taken her apart. She had a single, massive puncture wound through the center of her chest armor. It was a clean strike, fast. Arthur fell to his knees. The grating dug into his kneecaps through his trousers. He stared at her face. It was pale, covered in grey dust. Her eyes closed as if she had just fallen asleep against the cold metal. He didn't cry. He expected to cry. He expected to howl with grief, to tear at his own hair, to curse the universe for its cruelty. But the only thing he felt was a vast, echoing emptiness. It was a hollow void right in the center of his being. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched her shoulder. The fabric of her uniform was stiff with dried blood. She was cold, so incredibly cold. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. His voice was muffled by the rebreather mask, sounding synthetic and alien to his own ears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I Ahid. Brody stood in the doorway, his heavy armor silent. He didn't offer any comforting platitudes. He didn't tell Arthur it wasn't his fault or that he couldn't have done anything to save them. The soldier knew better than to lie to a survivor. "Get the tags, Pendleton," Brody said quietly. It wasn't an order, it was an anchor, a tether thrown into the dark to pull Arthur back to reality. Arthur fumbled with numb fingers, unclipping the metal identification tags from Sarah's collar. He moved to the console, refusing to look at Cole's face, and retrieved his tags as well. He shoved the cold metal into his pocket, the sound clinking loudly in the silent tomb. He stood up, his legs shaking, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked around the bunker one last time, the place where he had spent the last 3 days waiting to die. "Let's go," Arthur said. They walked back down the dark corridor, leaving the ghosts behind in the dark. Arthur didn't look back. The warship was waiting above, howling in the void, ready to carry the broken pieces of humanity back to the stars. Arthur knew he would never forget the smell of this place. He would never forget the taste of the ash. But as he climbed the ladder toward the harsh, glaring lights of the landing zone, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was alive, and for now that brutal, ugly fact would have to be enough. Arthur sat strapped into the acceleration couch of evac transport Delta 9er, his breathing shallow. The thick restraint webbing dug relentlessly into his fractured clavicle, but he did not adjust it. He welcomed the sharp, grounding pain. It was a tangible anchor holding him to the physical world, keeping his mind from drifting back down into the dark, crushed confines of the subterranean bunker. The transport bay smelled heavily of aerosolized antiseptic, leaking hydraulic fluid, and the collective, unwashed fear of 30 traumatized civilians. It was a suffocating, deeply human cocktail that clung to the back of his throat. Across from him sat a woman holding a small boy in her lap. The kid was staring blankly at the ribbed metal ceiling, his thumb resting limply in his mouth. He wasn't crying. None of the civilians were crying. They were all hollowed out, their emotional reserves completely spent over the last 72 hours of sustained terror. They were ghost ships, drifting on the residual fumes of medical stabilizers and sheer, unadulterated shock. Brody wasn't on the transport. The heavy infantry had remained on the surface, holding the perimeter while the fleet stripped New Texas of anything valuable. Arthur felt a strange, irrational pang of abandonment. Brody was a killer, a violently pragmatic man encased in a walking tank, but he was also the only person who had looked at Arthur without pity or judgment. "Atmospheric seal engaged," a sterile, automated voice announced over the ship's intercom system. "Prepare for vertical ascent. Brace." The transport did not lift off smoothly. There was no gentle anti-gravity cushion. It violently punched its way upward, utilizing raw chemical thrust to break the planet's hold. Gravity slammed into Arthur's chest, pinning him against the padded webbing with the force of a physical blow. His breath was forced out of his lungs in a sharp, involuntary grunt. The metallic hull of the dropship groaned in protest, vibrating with a high-frequency, teeth-rattling intensity that shook the dust loose from the ventilation grates. He closed his eyes tight. The neurostabilizers injected by Hayes were completely gone now, leaving his nervous system raw and exposed. The physical sensation of leaving the planet felt akin to tearing a dirty bandage off a massive, unhealed wound. He was leaving Sarah. He was leaving Cole. He was leaving 10 years of his mundane, predictable life to burn in the alien-infested ash below. Clear of the troposphere, the intercom chimed. The crushing weight on his chest eased immediately, replaced by the strange, disorienting, floating sensation of microgravity. The transport had leveled out, preparing to dock. Arthur reached up with a trembling hand and unbuckled his heavy harness. The metal latch clicked loudly in the silent bay. Nobody else moved. They all remained strapped in, staring at nothing. Arthur gripped the overhead handrails, his heavy boots floating mere inches above the non-slip deck plating, and pulled himself toward the small, scratched viewport located at the rear of the bay. He looked down. New Texas was a dying ember floating in the black. The vast, carefully curated agricultural domes he had spent years managing were entirely gone, replaced by sprawling, glowing black scars that stretched across the continents. The human fleet hovered above it all, in low orbit, a massive constellation of jagged steel armor and glowing blue plasma drives. They looked like mechanical vultures circling a fresh carcass. They weren't saving the world. They were just salvaging the scrap. A heavy hand clamped onto his good shoulder. Arthur flinched hard. Spinning around, his boots slipping against the deck. It was Quartermaster Reed. The logistics officer had stripped off his outer uniform jacket, revealing a sweat-stained grey undershirt that clung to his lean frame. He looked just as exhausted as the civilians he was transporting, the dark circles under his eyes bruised and heavy. "Don't stare at it too long, Pendleton," Reed said softly. The sharp, authoritative edge he had wielded on the landing zone was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, cynical exhaustion. "Looking back doesn't change the math. The rock is gone." "Why didn't you come sooner?" Arthur asked. The words slipped out of his mouth before his brain could filter them. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine, desperate plea for understanding. "Command had our telemetry from the first drop. They knew the swarm tonnage was coming. Why did they cut the comms? Why did they let us think we were dead?" Reed sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a grease-stained thumb. "Because if we told you we were 3 days out, the panic would have caused the garrison to break formation. You would have scattered." Arthur frowned, confusion battling the grief. "Scattered?" "The swarm hunts movement and ambient heat signatures," Reed explained, his voice entirely flat. "If 90,000 terrified people ran for the hills, trying to reach the backup shelters in the Badlands, they would have been slaughtered out in the open in a matter of hours. By cutting the comms, we forced you to hunker down, to consolidate in the reinforced bunkers. It gave us a massive, concentrated target to drop on." Arthur stared at him, the cold, brutal logic making his stomach violently churn. The bitter taste of bile rose in the back of his throat. "You used us as bait." "We used you as an anvil," Reed corrected, his eyes meeting Arthur's without flinching. "If the swarm hadn't pooled around the colony centers trying to dig you out, we wouldn't have been able to hit them with the orbital plasma strikes. We traded the colony's infrastructure for the fleet's tactical advantage. It's ugly, it's horrific, but it's the only reason you are standing here breathing recycled air right now." Reed turned away, grabbing a handrail and pushing himself back toward the armored cockpit, leaving Arthur entirely alone at the scratched viewport. Arthur looked back down at the burning world. The fleet was beginning to break their holding formation, their massive plasma drives flaring blue-white as they prepared to adjust their vectors. He felt the cold metal of Sarah and Cole's identification tags digging into his thigh through his soiled pocket. They were the anvil. They had paid the ultimate price for this brutal retreat. The transport shuddered violently as it breached the upper atmosphere, the magnetic clamps engaging as it docked with the massive, waiting bulk of the warship. The airlock hissed, equalizing pressure with a sharp pop that made Arthur's ears ring. Arthur turned away from the viewport. There was absolutely no going back. The interior of the warship was a stark, jarring contrast to the chaotic, blood-soaked dirt of the colony surface. It was a sprawling labyrinth of sterile white bulkheads, humming air scrubbers, and harsh, unblinking fluorescent lighting. It smelled of ozone, chemical disinfectant, and recycled oxygen, completely devoid of the scent of ash or burnt flesh. Arthur was corralled by heavily armed guards into a massive forward cargo bay that had been hastily converted into a civilian processing center. Thousands of survivors from across the ruined colony were huddled in designated grid squares painted on the floor, wrapped in the exact same cheap foil blankets, eating the exact same tasteless synthetic nutrient paste from plastic tubes. It was an industrialized factory line of trauma. Combat medics in pristine white fatigues moved methodically through the crowds, scanning retinas and administering mandatory quarantine inoculations with cold, pneumatic hiss clicks. Armed security personnel, their faces hidden behind opaque dark visors, stood rigidly at every exit point. They weren't there to protect the civilians. They were there to maintain strict order, to ensure the infectious panic didn't spread to the ship's vital engineering systems. Arthur sat alone in Grid Alpha 7, pulling his knees to his chest, his back resting against a cold, vibrating steel bulkhead. He had surrendered Sarah and Cole's metal tags to a logistics clerk nearly an hour ago. The clerk hadn't offered condolences. She had simply scanned the barcodes, dropped the tags into a plastic bin filled with hundreds of identical others, and handed Arthur a datapad displaying his newly assigned bunk number. That was it. 10 years of shared meals, bad jokes, and genuine friendship completely reduced to a digital barcode scan and a plastic bin. "Hey, buddy," Arthur slowly raised his head. Brody was standing over him. The heavy hydraulic infantry armor was gone, replaced by a standard-issue charcoal gray ship jumpsuit. He looked slightly smaller without the massive ablative plating, but his shoulders were still impossibly broad, and the jagged scar running across his chin looked angry and red under the harsh overhead lighting. He was holding two dented metal thermoses. Brody sat down heavily next to Arthur, the metal deck groaning slightly under his weight, and tossed one of the thermoses directly into Arthur's lap. "Real coffee?" Brody grunted, staring straight ahead at the crowd. "Bribed a mess hall supply sergeant with a carton of smuggled earth tobacco. I pulled off a dead lieutenant. Drink it before the synthetics completely ruin your palate." Arthur unscrewed the metal lid. The smell hit him instantly, bypassing his logic and striking directly at his emotional core. It was rich, dark, and earthy. It smelled exactly like his old apartment. It smelled like the quiet, peaceful mornings before the sky tore open and the monsters fell. He raised it to his lips and took a slow sip. It was scalding hot, incredibly bitter, and easily the best thing he had ever tasted. "Thank you," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Brody took a long, slow pull from his own thermos, his eyes scanning the sea of traumatized survivors. "Don't thank me, kid. It's just a hot drink. Tomorrow they're going to put you in a sterile debriefing room, and they're going to systematically squeeze every memory you have of that bunker out of your head. They want the raw tactical data, how the swarm moves, how they formulate their breaches, what frequency they screech at. You're not going to get the luxury of forgetting it, Arthur." "I don't want to forget it," Arthur said. The words surprised him. They tasted like ash in his mouth, but they were undeniably true. "If I forget it, then they died for absolutely nothing. They just become another finalized number in Reed's logistical ledger." Brody slowly turned his head, looking at Arthur with a quiet, heavy respect that he hadn't shown on the planet's surface. "That's the burden, kid. We carry the dead so they don't have to walk alone in the dark. It's a heavy, miserable pack, but you eventually get used to the weight." A deep, vibrating hum suddenly resonated through the deck plating, traveling up Arthur's spine and rattling his teeth. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, dipping into a momentary brownout. "Jump drive spooling," Brody noted calmly, glancing up at the ceiling. "We're leaving the system." Arthur closed his eyes. He didn't feel the paralyzing, suffocating terror he had felt down in the bunker. He didn't feel the hollow, floating disconnect he had experienced on the landing zone. He felt surprisingly grounded. The hot coffee warmed his empty stomach, and the dull, persistent ache in his fractured shoulder constantly reminded him that his body was still functioning. He was imperfect. He had been a coward. He had hidden in the dark, clutching a useless rifle, while his friends fought and died violently. But he was alive. The human race wasn't a shining, noble beacon of hope in the galaxy. They were brutal, calculating, and ruthlessly cold. They traded millions of lives for tactical advantages. They turned their own soldiers into mechanical butchers. But out here, in the cold, unfeeling void of space, against a mindless, endless tide of consumption, morality was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. They didn't send aid, they sent war, and sometimes war was the only thing that could keep the darkness at bay. The warship lurched forward, a massive structural groan echoing through the vast cargo bay as the jump drives fully engaged. Reality stretched and warped, the fundamental laws of physics bending to the brute force will of human engineering. Arthur opened his eyes. The ship had slipped into the slipstream. They were howling through the void, a solitary, heavily armed island carrying the broken, bleeding remnants of a lost world. Arthur took another long sip of his coffee. He was a survivor, and starting tomorrow, he would finally figure out how to live with that. Thank you for riding with us to the bitter end of New Texas. If this gritty, boots-on-the-ground look at humanity's brutal survival struck a chord with you, please hit that like button and share this video. It tells the algorithm you want more raw, unfiltered HFY sci-fi stories that don't hold back. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a drop pod deployment. What did you think of Arthur's journey from cowardice to cold acceptance? Sound off in the comments below. Stay safe out there in the dark void, and see you next time.